A spate of animal killings leave a community in Norfolk bewildered and horrified.
There was a cat reported with its ears cut off and slashed down its back. There was somebody clearly trying to inflict serious pain.
Almost 2 years later, in Merseyside, an elderly man is brutally murdered in his own home in a seemingly motiveless crime.
The victim had multiple blunt force trauma. The attacker struck the victim in a surprise attack.
Although the two attacks were hundreds of miles apart, it would become clear that they were inextricably connected.
He's talked at length about killing humans as a progression from killing cats.
This murder town is Birkenhead. Killers are unpredictable. They can attack anyone at any time. Their motives are often varied, and chillingly, in a number of cases, their reason to kill is completely unknown. Some can be organised and planned with meticulous efficiency, whilst others are more opportunistic. They live amongst us in our towns and cities, and one thing sets them apart from the rest of society: their terrifying capacity to kill. Welcome to Murdertown.
Do you feel it in the air? Everything is changing, a world wasted by fear. Something wicked this way comes. Something wicked this way comes. It's been around since time began. A million times around the sun. Something wicked this way comes. Something wicked this way comes.
This is Birkenhead in Merseyside, a town located on the Wirral Peninsula. It's separated from the city of Liverpool by the River Mersey. Its location makes it part of the busy port of Liverpool, with boats leaving regularly to take passengers to Dublin, Belfast, and the Isle of Man.
It's a very working class town. If you're from outside the area, you might not be able to distinguish the accent with Liverpool. It's kind of a very Liverpool-focused town.
Birkenhead was sort of historically known for like shipbuilding. It's still got the Camel Laird shipyard there.
There are pockets of severe deprivation. It's got problems with poverty, with child poverty. There's problems with unemployment and addiction.
I don't think Birkenhead is a dangerous place. As a reporter, there are areas which you go out to maybe more than once with similar crimes. And while Birkenhead does have some of its problems, it's not really one of those areas where you think, oh, I don't really want to like leave my car there or whatever.
There are troubles there and there is crime linked to that. That's a completely different story to what happened in this case.
The village of Prenton is one of Birkenhead's more popular suburbs and was home to 69-year-old Martin Decker, who'd lived in the area all his life.
Martin Decker, he had a very close and tight-knit family. He was very well liked. He was close to his brother and he had two nieces. I think he was also very close to his mum. He was in her 80s at the time this happened. He described somebody who was very committed to his career and he worked hard. He had a fun side, he loved to travel. He was a very big fan of the local football team, Tranmere Rovers.
He was a very well-respected figure in the community. Certainly with the work that he'd done. I mean, he'd retired in 2012. Part of the work he'd done was to set up this team called the Unity Team, which saw lawyers working with rape and serious sexual offences alongside police to try and tackle it. And with his family as well, he was very close to his mother. He was sort of pop round every day to see her. She was 88, and 5 siblings. They all thought really highly of him.
He was quite a private person. Probably because of his career as well, he wouldn't have put himself out there too much. He didn't have a social media profile that we were able to find. He wasn't that kind of person, I don't think. Well, yeah, the fact he was involved in prosecuting serious cases was a very shocking detail.
Martin was a single man who lived alone, and in March 2021, he was shielding due to the COVID outbreak that was crippling the nation.
We know for everyone it was extremely difficult. He was someone who was single and lived alone, so this sense of isolation would have been greater for him than it would have been for someone who lived with a partner or a family. He enjoyed the community around his football team and the socialising that went with that. So it would have been probably quite a trying year for him.
The combination of COVID and loneliness led Martin Decker to make a rash decision in March 2021. It was a decision that he would pay for with his life.
Mr. Decker was a single man, perhaps looking for some company. He answered an advert on a website called Viva Street. It's a place where you pay for a sex worker. The two chatted online, the text messages were exchanged, and they agreed to meet for 2 hours for a £250 payment.
They've messaged the day before, the 5th of March, and the morning of March the 6th, we know from CCTV that Martin Decker goes to the cash machine, so we assume that he's getting the money ready to meet him that evening.
Mr. Decker answered the door. There was a knock on the door. He saw the man he'd arranged to meet and invited him aside. We understand that he offered him a drink and he turned his back, and that's when the attack happened.
On the evening of the 7th of March 2021, Martin's brother Jeremy Decker visited Martin's flat. Their mother was concerned, having not heard from Martin all day. Jeremy let himself in and was met with a horrifying scene.
There was also no defensive injuries. The attacker struck the victim in a surprise attack.
Because we didn't know a lot, there were a lot of questions. Lawyer, is it that situation where he has upset someone or someone's come out of prison? It's definitely a thought that went through people's heads.
On Sunday, the 7th of March 2021, Jeremy Decker was about to let himself into his brother's flat, here at Viner Croft. 69-year-old Martin Decker hadn't been in touch with his family all day, which was unusual, so their mother had asked Jeremy to check in and make sure all was okay.
He normally goes and sees his mum, and he hadn't been to see her. And eventually his brother, Jeremy, goes round to the house about 5-ish in the afternoon.
He knocked on the door, there was no answer, and he had a key to get in, and when he went in, he was confronted with an absolutely horrific scene. He saw his brother with terrible injuries. He could see that it was obvious to him that the flat had been ransacked and an untidy search, and he knew very quickly that his brother was dead, and there was nothing he could do.
Jeremy found his brother Martin at around 5:20 p.m, lying dead at the rear of his house. He had been repeatedly struck with what would later be identified as a hammer. It was clear that this was the scene of a brutal and frenzied murder.
On examining the body on this occasion, it was clear that the victim had multiple blunt force trauma to the rear of the head, and therefore one could assume that he was attacked from behind. There was also no defensive injury, so again this indicates that there was no struggle and that the attacker struck the victim in a surprise attack, and therefore the victim knew nothing about this or certainly couldn't defend themselves.
A forensic pathologist said that he'd been struck around 9 times to the head, so it was a very savage attack, and it was within seconds of him opening the door. It was very quick. He would have been severely wounded before he realised what was happening, most likely.
At first glance, this appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. However, that theory quickly changed when the police learned that Martin Decker had planned to invite a stranger into his home.
Police would be looking at any electronic device that the victim may have in their possession. Most people nowadays own a mobile phone or a computer or both, and multiple items, and these potentially have a huge amount of information on them that can support an investigation of this nature. A digital media investigator, a DMI, would have been appointed as part of the investigation team. Their responsibility would have been to assist the SIO with coming up with a strategy as to what we're going to do with all these electronic devices, how we're going to get into them, and more importantly, what is in the content of that information. Quite often it's fairly easy to get into these devices. If they're password protected, it can be a little bit more tricky. But in this day and age, with face recognition or thumbprint or something like that, it's fairly easy to get in. And then you start looking at what apps they've been on recently. Have there been any phone calls or text messages sent in the last 24 hours that might indicate who he's been communicating with?
Using information obtained from his mobile phone, the police were starting to try and piece together what might have happened to Martin Decker. At this early stage, they were keeping their findings under wraps, so the media started to speculate that the killing could be linked to Martin's former career.
Because we didn't know a lot, there were a lot of sort of questions going around in your head, and you do think, lawyer, is it that kind of situation where he has upset someone or someone's come out of prison? It's speculation, there was nothing to base it on, but I think it's definitely a thought that went through people's heads.
We know that a man had been found with severe injuries. There hadn't been an immediate arrest, which you might find in a domestic violence type case. You know, whether he's targeted because he was a lawyer involved in prosecuting serious cases, and his particular specialism was sexual offences. He was a part of the Unity team dedicated to prosecuting rape and historical sexual abuse. So the people he would have been prosecuting would have been sentenced to significant prison sentences. The stigma of being convicted of a sexual offence would obviously be lifelong. Is this somebody whose case he's worked on? Is this somebody who's put in prison and come back to take the revenge? I think there's a lot of interest there.
The focus of the investigation now centred on identifying exactly who had committed this savage attack and why. Unbeknownst to Merseyside police, just 24 hours later, the killer was in the process of being questioned by officers 250 miles away for an entirely unconnected case.
Police weren't linking these two things at all at the time. A woman in Dartford in Kent has rang police on the morning of the 8th of March, and she says she's met a man online. He asked to come and stay. He arrived at a house the night before, and now he was refusing to leave, and she was scared.
When the police arrived at the request of the female to remove this individual from her address in Dartford, they would have spoken to the female in the first instance to establish if any criminal offences had taken place. If no criminal offences have taken place, then it's quite possible just to ask the person to leave, and they may leave on their own volition with no issues at all. Having spoken to the individual and asked him to leave, the officers asked for his name, and we believe he gave a false name, an alias that he uses.
The man has introduced himself as Jesse King, and he's then left the house, and he's gone to stay in a hotel in London from there.
The man who was questioned in Dartford on Sunday, March the 7th, told the police his name was Jesse King. However, his real name was David Iwo, and he was a man with a troubling history of violence.
In the Norfolk area in Norwich, there'd been numerous reports of cats being mutilated and killed. It wasn't kids messing about. It didn't seem to be somebody killing them for pest control reasons or anything like that. There was a cat reported with its ears cut off and slashed down its back. There was somebody clearly trying to inflict serious pain.
My mum had my youngest child, and me and my oldest were going to spend some time together, and we were painting our nails and just having a bit of girly time. We had opened the door to let my cat Bubba in. Somehow I didn't actually notice anything wrong with him. He just came in how he normally does, came and laid on the sofa. And I caught something out the corner of my eye that didn't look right. And then I noticed it on his side. There was a cut there. So I freaked out a little bit, called my partner through. I thought he'd been run over by a car or something. He came through to check him and he noticed that one of his ears were missing. I was too scared to pick Bubba up to put him in the cat carrier because of how bad he looked. Got him to the vets and they took him straight through, and we was waiting there for a while. And the vet had called us in and he had told us that his wounds were done by a person. The slices on his ears were too straight to be done with anything else. It had to be a knife. And they told us to contact the police to report it. My worst fear before we got him there is I thought Bubba was going to have to be put to sleep. We didn't think he was going to come home. Sorry.
Chillingly, Georgina soon discovered that the attack on Bubba wasn't an isolated incident.
After what had happened to Bubba, I was asked to make a Facebook page for him to keep people updated that was following him. Through that page, people were contacting me, telling me things they'd heard and seen. So that's how I came to find out more on different cats that had been hurt. Bubba was in April, and they all followed within weeks of each other or days. A lot of people were keeping their cats in as well, just to try and prevent someone from being able to hurt their animals. And there was a lot of people that were angry. There was a few people that were keeping an eye out for anything, if they spot any suspicious behaviour around animals.
The fact there were so many cases in the same area, I think most people would have just assumed it was the same person.
I think it's extremely concerning when you hear about the volume of animals that were harmed and tortured by this individual. This wasn't a one-off case. This was a targeted attack over a period of time. And when you look at that individual, you have to be concerned as to, well, what is next? Where is this individual going to go after this? How are they getting their kicks from doing something like this? And if you can harm that many animals, this person is capable of anything, I would suggest.
At the time that the attacks were happening, he was nicknamed as the NR3 Cat Killer. There was a postcode that seemed to be the focus of these killings. It would have been a fairly simple process for them to work out with somebody local who was doing this. In these kind of cases, it's fairly rare for a suspect to be identified. They don't always necessarily get the resources that other major crime investigations would get. It was a case where a man was identified and the police were actively seeking him at the time.
In March and April 2019, 30 cats were killed, mutilated and tortured in and around the NR3 postcode of Norwich. It was believed all these incidents were the actions of the same person, dubbed the NR3 Cat Killer.
I'm Dr. Ruth Tully. I'm a consultant forensic psychologist and I primarily work with violent offenders. In my clinical experience, it's highly unlikely that these concerning behaviours begin in adulthood. Quite often there have been such behaviours in childhood, it's just that we don't know about them. It's really important to remember that violence is a decision and that actually the things that people have gone through in their life, and importantly how they've interpreted those things and how they decide to behave, is what contributes to violent decision makings and unfortunately creates victims.
The investigation into the NR3 Cat Killer in March 2019, 2 years before the murder of Martin Decker, led the police to an individual by the name of David Iwo. This wasn't a name that was released to the public, though.
In early 2019, David Iwo was arrested for cruelty to animals. He'd been caught scooping a cat into a bag and trying to leave the area. He was questioned over that and released on bail, and he was later charged with causing unnecessary cruelty to a protected animal.
Police will do all they can to try and prosecute this type of criminal behaviour, but sometimes the evidence it just isn't there to try and get it over the threshold to charge someone and convict someone. And so you're then left with this really difficult position where you've got somebody who you know or believe is responsible for carrying out these horrendous acts, but you're powerless to stop them being out on the streets and living a normal life on the face of it.
He had a court date. I think there were several court dates, actually.
I built myself up. I was so excited for this court date, and then that was adjourned. I want to say it kind of broke me down a bit. I thought we was going to get that closure and just finish that chapter. So then February, again, I kind of got my hopes up a bit. Not as much as last time. It's hard to keep that excitement back. But yeah, I was like quite upset and quite angry that he didn't turn up.
He was on the run. We don't know precisely how long he was living this lifestyle. So the magistrates or the district judge there issued a warrant for his arrest.
Despite being the prime suspect in the cat killings, Iwo was released without charge. But it soon became clear that he'd carried out the horrific acts, and it wasn't long before he shifted his focus to a different type of victim.
Just before 6, he arrives at Martin Decker's home. He was captured on CCTV leaving the property.
On this particular occasion, they know they're dealing with a person that has used extreme violence on another human being. So this person is dangerous and potentially armed.
Stretch hands, please!
In March 2021, the body of retired lawyer Martin Decker was found in his flat in Birkenhead by his brother Jeremy. He'd been bludgeoned to death by 9 blows to the head with a hammer.
When you turn up at a crime scene like that, originally, your first thoughts are, oh my goodness, who has done this? How are we going to solve this? If there's nothing obvious around to suggest who the suspect is, it can be a real head-scratching moment.
By studying his mobile phone data, police learned that on the days leading up to his murder, Martin had arranged for a young man, 23-year-old David Iwo, to visit him at his home on the 6th of March.
When you come across something so quickly in an investigation like this on an electronic device that effectively indicates who your suspect is, it's a magic moment. You think, right, this is definitely a clear suspect that we need to be looking at and identifying and arresting as quickly as possible.
Police were aware David Iwo had been suspected and questioned over the NR3 Cat Killer attacks in Norfolk in 2019, and now they could place him as the last person to see Martin Decker alive. Was it possible that he could have gone from killing animals to killing people?
David Iwo had a history of torturing and mutilating cats. Clearly that's a massive concern just because of the behaviour in itself. But actually, people who harm animals won't necessarily go on to harm humans. But in someone who has been violent against a human being, we would look at that history and look at the concerning nature of that history. Because what it provides us with is more evidence of this sadistic type nature. And in my experience, I have worked with people who've committed serious violent crimes, murder offences, who do have a history of harming animals. Historically, it's been looked at as, wow, this child is harming an animal, they're definitely going to go on and commit violence against humans. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, contrary to popular belief, young people who are violent often desist from violence, particularly if they've got support, if they've got strategies in place or interventions to help them with that. So the majority of young people who are violent desist. But there are a minority who go into this serious and persistent group who continue to display violence, and that's where we'd be looking at, with concern, that prior behaviour of harming animals, whether that's as a child or indeed as an adult.
With the police able to link David Iwo to Martin Decker, they were under pressure to apprehend him and bring him in for questioning. To this end, detectives turned to the UK's extensive network of CCTV footage.
When you're looking at CCTV, it's really important to set parameters because you can create a huge amount of work by seizing a huge amount of material that quite often is irrelevant to the investigation. On this particular investigation, you had a start point, which was the scene itself, where the victim was found at his home address, so you'd look around that area. You'd have a rough idea of a time frame because of the conversations that had been taking place on the app. What was established on this particular case was that an ATM machine had been used at a particular time using the victim's card, and so officers were able to see if there's any CCTV that they could then work from there. You would start to identify individuals, and those individuals you would then do further work on to either eliminate them in your inquiry or implicate them in your inquiry. And when you get to a point where you've got somebody who you still haven't identified and they're not from the area, then that would start to create a bit more suspicion about that individual. And so you would start plotting further along the route with the cameras to establish where they go.
David Iwo, in the afternoon, about 5-ish, gets the bus into Liverpool city centre and then over the water to the Wirral. And just before 6-ish, he arrives at Martin Decker's home. He was captured on CCTV leaving the property. And then he's got on the bus. And he's been seen breaking up a mobile phone on the bus. And he goes back to Liverpool, stays in Liverpool that night, and the following morning he gets the train down to London.
He took the £250 that Mr. Decker had withdrawn. He ransacked the house. He took a laptop, a watch, a sound system, and he stuffed it into a bag and left the property and left Martin Decker lying in his house with devastating injuries. The suspect was obviously able to travel out of the area in the hours after the murder and travel to an address in Dartford where he stayed at a house of a woman he'd met on a dating app. They tracked his phone. They found that he tried to sell some of the items he stole from Martin Decker in a pawn shop.
Using CCTV to trace David Iwo's movements at around the time of Martin Decker's murder, the police were able to track him to a hotel in London. And on the 10th of March 2021, they prepared to make an arrest.
There are two types of arrest in these situations. One is dynamic. You stumble across the offender and you have to react. You have to do that dynamic risk assessment. And the other option is a pre-planned arrest. And on this particular occasion, they know they're dealing with a person that has used extreme violence on another human being. So this person is dangerous and potentially armed, either with a hammer or another weapon. What you're then trying to do is prevent any other person coming to harm or potentially, a hostage situation or siege situation with that individual.
Stretch hands, please! Please! Go down! Hey, mate. Hey, stop. What's your name, mate? What's your name? What's your name? Listen, mate, you've been under arrest for suspicion of murder, okay? You don't have to say anything, mate, on defence. You want to one question, something like the court.
7th of March, the body was found, and by the 10th of March, they'd arrested him, and he was in a completely different area of the country.
The timing from the moment the police were called to that address to the moment they had somebody in custody was exceptional. You had no idea at that particular time who was responsible. And so the quick time actions carried out by the police to identify a motive, a suspect, a location, and then recover that weapon all within a matter of 72 hours was fantastic.
And it was as they started examining David Iwo's belongings that police realised he had been within their grasp just 3 days earlier, the day after Martin Decker had been murdered.
When I was arrested, they found items in his hotel room, which clearly linked him to the murder. They were stolen from Martin Decker's home. So then the forensic evidence became the main focus of the investigation. Now with possession of Iwo's phone, they could see who else he'd been speaking to online, and there were numerous other people. He seems to have been chatting to a woman on another dating website and ended up many miles away in Dartford. He attended that address, spent the night there, and that woman contacted the police the following morning because he had refused to leave and she was scared. The woman was not injured, there was no assault on her. There was nothing that was serious enough to warrant an arrest. Iwo, who was using the name Jesse King at that point, agreed to leave, and he went on his way. Having made the report the day after the murder, the police returned to her home, obtained a search warrant and made a search of the home.
The decision to take a search warrant out on the address in Dartford was an excellent decision by the SIO because it gave them control of that address and they could take their time to actually look through that address. What they would have been looking for initially would have been any links for that offender to the victim up in Birkenhead. Did he have blood on his clothing or on his shoes that may have been transferred into that address, accidentally? So they would have been looking microscopically for any kind of evidence that would be linking the victim to that address.
What they found there was extremely significant. Unknown to the woman at this point, Iwo had stashed a murder weapon under a cushion on a couch. And so when police searched the property, they found a claw hammer stashed under this cushion with visible blood staining on the head and handle.
And having found that weapon, the police would have then taken a photograph of it in situ. They would have carefully, forensically wrapped that item, and then it would have been sent off to the lab ASAP for a quick turnaround to establish if we can link the victim to that weapon and the suspect to that weapon.
The police had a suspect and a potential murder weapon, so now had to wait for the results of DNA tests to see if the blood on the hammer would be a match to Martin Decker.
He called himself like a Trojan horse who would arrive at the houses of men who wanted his sexual services, and then he would attack them.
Was this a homophobic targeted attack? But then we have the female in Dartford. Was she the one that got away? How close was she to becoming the next victim?
In March 2021, 69-year-old retired lawyer Martin Decker was beaten to death with a hammer in his own home in the town of Birkenhead. David Iwo emerged as a prime suspect, and in tracking his movements, police were also able to secure what they believed was the murder weapon.
To then have this eureka moment of finding the murder weapon under a couch in that address, I don't think anyone thought that would have happened, by taking out this search warrant. So it was a fantastic decision.
The murder weapon was stashed under a cushion at the house of a woman he met on a dating app. It had blood on the head, which matched the DNA of Martin Decker. And of course, he had his DNA on the handle. Some of his clothing had Martin Decker's DNA.
The evidence against Iwo was extensive. And on the 12th of March 2021, he was charged with the murder of Martin Decker.
We don't know that much about him. He didn't live locally to Martin Decker. He seemed to sort of drift a bit from different places. We know that he lived in Norwich for a while. We know that he had previously lived in Liverpool because he came up and stayed here the night before the murder. But at the start of that week, he'd been in Penzance train station. He'd gone to London. In terms of where he's based, it's not really clear. And he doesn't have a job, but he does advertise on this website, Viva Street, offering sort of sexual services.
He appeared to be sustaining his lifestyle and getting money to live by placing adverts on websites online and on social media for gay men.
Was this a homophobic targeted attack as well on that individual? But then we have the case where he then spent the night with a female in Dartford. Was she the one that got away? You know, how close was she to becoming the next victim?
While he was questioned by the police, Iwo made some chilling admissions.
Surprisingly, when he's interviewed, he's quite open about the fact that, you know, he was going to go on a killing spree effectively, and he wasn't going to stop until he got caught.
He didn't believe he'd get reported because of the embarrassment and the shame and stigma potentially linked to hiring a sex worker. He described how he started by robbing these men and stealing the money, stealing the valuables. The attacks became steadily more violent. He said he made a conscious decision that his lifestyle was going to be sustained by killing and robbing gay men. So he was able to exploit people's fear of social rejection, people's fear of being outed perhaps, to operate almost with impunity. He was confident and comfortable attacking people, safe in the knowledge that it would be unlikely to be reported to the police, whether that drove him to think he'd be able to get away with murder. In an interview with a psychiatrist, he described he had a hatred for his parents and he fantasised about killing them. He said that progressed to fantasising about killing anyone. I think people see this as it's a tragedy, and the death of Martin Decker was a huge blow for his family. But there's also a sense that if it had not been identified, there would have been more victims.
He's talked at length about killing Martin Decker, why he did it, how he did it, what else he'd done. He's spoken about killing humans as a progression from killing cats. He called himself like a Trojan horse who would arrive at the houses of men who wanted his sexual services, and then he would attack them.
Whilst we can't pinpoint why David Ayu targeted gay men specifically, the psychiatrists at the time reported that he had antisocial or dissocial traits and narcissistic traits. So if someone has a specific dislike or hatred towards a specific group who they may think are less worthy than themselves, and they have an interest and a desire to be violent, this might have provided him with the internal motivation, the internal justification for committing violence against this specific group. David Ayu talked a lot about how he would have continued to offend had he not been caught, and how he was interested in killing more gay men if he'd have had the opportunity. In my experience, saying things that make somebody look worse or more risky when they're being sentenced or when they're being tried for an offence is quite unusual, because quite often someone is motivated to self-present quite well. This can be from a number of factors. One could be wanting to make an impact on the people around him, or find unusual or interesting and to maintain other people's interest. He may just have been very open and honest about his future intentions. That's not necessarily that he was asking for help, it's perhaps just telling his truth. What it tells us as observers and the police is that this person was clearly an ongoing and future risk, and it was a good job that he was caught before he went on to harm other people. Ultimately, we'll never know why he targeted gay men and why he had these attitudes towards gay men. Only he will know.
At his trial in September 2021, David Iwo refused legal representation and pleaded guilty to the murder of Martin Decker. Then in October 2021, he appeared at Preston Crown Court to be sentenced.
The case was heard at Preston Crown Court. I covered it via video link because of COVID at the time. He was calm during the hearing. He didn't seem particularly upset or bothered about being sentenced to life in prison. At the beginning of the sentence hearing at Preston Crown Court in November last year, just before the case started, he sacked his legal team. So some of the details that we may have found out about him did not get said in open court. Some of what we might have learned about his history and where he grew up and any potential issues from his childhood were kept secret.
I think he just didn't want to engage with the authority of the process. He was like smirking and laughing through the whole thing.
The judge had to speak to him directly to ask why he dismissed his legal team and whether he wanted to be represented, and he said he didn't. He wanted to speak for himself. The Crown Prosecution Service and the Courts and Tribunal Service had to deal with this cat case, so he was charged and appeared at Wirral Magistrates Court in Birkenhead to face multiple counts of cruelty to a protected animal. So in that case, he already knew that a life sentence was effectively on the cards for the murder of Martin Decker. The hearing itself was relatively short. It was simply, this is the evidence, these are the things he said afterwards. He's pleaded guilty, and then it was up to the judge to decide the minimum tariff that he'd serve in prison.
He was given a life sentence with a minimum of 33 years. And at the same time, these proceedings in Norwich with the cats were ongoing, and he'd refused to enter pleas to them.
And he made a comment in that court hearing. He told the magistrates, "Fuck your cats, I've got bigger fish to fry," which kind of gives you a sense of how he viewed proceedings and what he felt about what he'd done. There was no sense of remorse, there was no sense of guilt. He did not care about the upset he caused. The prosecution applied to let that indictment lie on file, which essentially means that it's not in the public interest to progress with that case.
Because he pleaded guilty to the murder, the sentence that he got for the murder would have been well over and above what he would have been sentenced for the cats anyway.
The judge didn't want to put him up there to do any more gloating and hurt us even more. He said at one point, if we want to know where the cat's ears are, then he can tell us. You hear about stories of like killers that keep things for trophies, and that was one of my worries, that he'd held on to Bubba's ears for like a trophy. I was relieved to know that he's behind bars and for the sentence that he's got, and I was quite happy that he's in there. I can't describe what sort of person he is. It's just disgusting.
David Iwo's disturbing pattern of behaviour saw him graduate from killing and torturing cats in Norwich to meticulously planning and executing the murder of Martin Decker over 200 miles away in Birkenhead. It was a shocking crime that this town will never forget, but fortunately, due to the excellent work carried out by the police, the man responsible was stopped before he would inevitably have killed again.